Everything you think you know about the American frontier was built on a movie set, not on history. For 70 years, studios took a messy, complicated, often boring reality and repainted it as a clean story of good guys, bad guys, and quick-draw duels at high noon. These 25 facts come from military payroll records, county court files, railroad ledgers, and newspaper archives that never made it into a single Western film. Some of them were buried on purpose because they were inconvenient. Others were simply too strange to fit a 2-hour script. Stay until fact 25. It rewrites the exact moment the Old West actually ended. And it is not the date you learned in school. Fact 1. Billy. The Kid killed far fewer men than the legend claims. Dime novels claimed Billy the Kid killed 21 men, one for every year of his life. Hollywood kept repeating that number because it made a better poster. Historians who cross-checked Coroner's reports, court testimony, and newspaper obituaries from New Mexico in the 1870s and 1880s found direct evidence for only 4 killings where he pulled the trigger alone, plus a handful more where he was one of several shooters in a group fight. That is it. 4 confirmed, not 21. The number 21 was invented by a ghostwriter working for the man who killed him, Sheriff Pat Garrett, because a book about killing a minor cattle rustler does not sell. A book about gunning down the deadliest outlaw in the West does. Garrett needed the Kid to be a monster to justify the manhunt, and readers back east wanted a monster too. The legend was not history. It was a marketing decision made after the body was already in the ground, and nobody who bought the book ever checked the math. Fact 2. Judge Roy Bean. Almost never sentenced anyone to death. Judge Roy Bean called himself the only law west of the Pecos, and every Western that mentions him shows a saloon-owning hanging judge who sends men to the gallows for sport. Court records from Val Verde County tell a very different story. Bean issued exactly 1 death sentence in his entire career, and the prisoner escaped before it was carried out. What Bean actually did, day after day, was fine people small amounts of money for minor offenses and pocket the cash himself. Since he was also the bartender collecting the fines at his own bar, he once famously fined a dead man $40 for carrying a concealed weapon, simply because the corpse had that much cash in his pocket, and Bean needed the money for something else that week. He was not a hanging judge. He was a small-town con man running a courtroom as a side hustle to his liquor sales, and Hollywood turned a petty grifter into a frontier executioner because petty grifters do not fill theater seats. Fact 3. Most gunfights were ambushes, not duels. The high noon showdown, 2 men walking toward each other on an empty street, is almost entirely a Hollywood invention. Historical records of documented shootings across Kansas, Texas, and Arizona cattle towns show the overwhelming majority happened from behind, in the dark, or while the victim was unarmed, drunk, or asleep. Wild Bill Hickok, one of the men the duel myth is built around, was shot in the back of the head while playing cards. John Wesley Hardin, one of the deadliest men of the era by his own count, shot a man for snoring too loudly through a hotel wall without ever seeing his face. There was no code of honor. There was no fair fight waiting to happen at noon. There was just whoever got the advantage first, usually while the other man's back was turned. And movies could not sell that because an ambush in the dark does not make for a satisfying final act on a movie poster. Audiences wanted to believe men faced each other like equals before one of them died. The paperwork says otherwise, almost every single time. Fact 4. Saloons served garbage, not fine whiskey. Every saloon scene shows amber whiskey poured from a crystal-clean bottle under warm lamplight. In reality, frontier saloons rarely had access to real-aged bourbon because shipping glass bottles across unpaved territory was expensive, slow, and often broke half the shipment before it arrived. Bartenders mixed raw grain alcohol with burnt sugar for color, chewing tobacco for bite, and sometimes gunpowder or turpentine to fake a stronger kick. Newspapers of the era nicknamed the result tarantula juice and tanglefoot because of what it did to a man's legs after 2 glasses. People were not drinking fine liquor while a piano played in the corner. They were drinking something closer to industrial solvent, and plenty of documented deaths in frontier towns were listed simply as bad whiskey, with no gunfight, no outlaw, and no drama involved at all. Fact 5. The entire cattle drive. Era lasted barely 20 years. Movies treat the long cattle drive. Cowboys pushing herds 1,000 miles to the railhead as the defining feature of the whole Old West. It lasted from about 1866 to 1886. 20 years, start to finish. Then barbed wire fencing and the arrival of railroad spurs directly into Texas made the entire profession pointless almost overnight. Ranchers no longer needed to walk cattle 1,000 miles across open country when a train could pick the herd up 2 counties over in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the risk. An entire cultural identity that dominates decades of American film, an image so strong it defines a whole nation's idea of itself, existed in reality for roughly the same length of time as a single home mortgage. Most of the men who actually rode those drives never did it more than 2 or 3 seasons before the work dried up, the pay stopped, or their knees gave out from 12-hour days in the saddle. The mythic cowboy era that Hollywood stretched across a century of film only happened, in real time, within the working lifetime of a single ranch hand. Fact 6. Barbed wire started more wars than outlaws did. When barbed wire patents spread across the plains in the late 1870s, big ranchers fenced off water sources and grazing land that had always been open to everyone under the old unwritten range rules. Small settlers and free-range cattlemen cut the fences at night and organized raids, sometimes hundreds of men riding together in the dark with wire cutters. Ranchers hired armed men specifically to guard the wire and shoot fence cutters on sight, no warning given. County after county reported deaths tied directly to fencing disputes, not bank robberies, not stagecoach holdups. Texas eventually had to pass a specific law making fence cutting a felony because the violence had gotten so far out of hand that ordinary law enforcement could not keep pace with it. The real war in the West was not fought between sheriffs and bandits. It was fought over property lines drawn in wire, and the men who fenced off a river usually won because they could afford lawyers, and the small ranchers on the other side of the fence usually could not. Fact 7. The Johnson County War was rich ranchers hunting poor ones. In 1892, a group of wealthy Wyoming cattle barons hired 25 professional gunmen from Texas, put them on a private train car, and sent them into Johnson County with a written death list of small ranchers they wanted eliminated, accused, without any trial, of cattle theft they could never actually prove in court. It was not lawmen chasing outlaws across the plains. It was millionaires paying assassins to remove economic competition using the language of justice as cover. The operation only stopped when the United States cavalry physically intervened to prevent what would have become an outright massacre of the entire county. Every rancher on that list survived because federal troops arrived in time, not because justice or the law prevailed on its own merit. Fact 8. Prostitution was a licensed, taxed industry. Frontier towns did not hide prostitution in back alleys out of shame. Many issued official municipal licenses for it and collected monthly fees, because a mining or cattle town with 10 men for every woman needed the tax revenue far more than it needed the appearance of virtue. Dodge City, Deadwood, and dozens of other towns kept formal registries of working women, complete with names and fee schedules filed at the county office. In several documented cases, those exact fees funded the town's only school building or its first hospital ward. The morally scandalous secret of the Old West was not hidden in the shadows. It was itemized, in plain ink, in the town's own municipal budget. Fact 9. Chinese workers built the railroad and were erased from the photo. More than 12,000 Chinese laborers built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, doing the most dangerous work with explosives on sheer cliff faces for lower pay than white workers doing the exact same job beside them. When the two rail lines finally connected at Promontory Summit in 1869, and the famous photograph was taken to celebrate the achievement, not a single Chinese worker appears anywhere in the picture, despite making up roughly 90% of the crew that physically laid that section of track. The image that defines this entire national achievement in American memory was staged deliberately to leave out the people who actually built it with their hands. Fact 10. The telegraph decided more outcomes than the six-shooter, and a lawman with access to a telegraph line could send a full description of a wanted man to the next 3 towns down the line before that outlaw's horse had even covered the distance. Manhunts that took weeks in the 1850s took days by the 1870s, purely because information could now travel faster than a person on horseback ever could. The gun gets all the credit in every movie poster ever printed, but the wire is what actually closed the frontier, town by town, faster than any marshal on any horse ever managed alone. Fact 11. Gunfighting was a side job, not an occupation. Almost every famous gunslinger held a completely ordinary day job that paid the actual bills. Wyatt Earp worked as a faro dealer and part-time lawman between mining ventures that mostly lost money. Doc Holliday was a licensed dentist before failing health pushed him into full-time gambling. Bat Masterson eventually gave up guns entirely and became a New York sports journalist writing about boxing matches. Nobody made a real living purely from being fast on the draw, because there was no economy that could sustain that as a job. The gunfighter identity that fills an entire genre of American film was, for the actual people involved, a weekend activity attached to a much more ordinary and far less cinematic main career. Most of these men would have found the label strange. They thought of themselves as car dealers, dentists, and shop owners who occasionally had to defend themselves, not as professional killers waiting for the next showdown. Fact 12. Most settlers lived in dirt, not log cabins. On the treeless plains of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, lumber for a proper log cabin had to be shipped in by rail and was far too expensive for most homesteading families to afford. Instead, families cut thick blocks of prairie sod, stacked them like bricks, and lived inside dirt houses that leaked mud through the ceiling every time it rained and occasionally dropped a snake into the kitchen without warning. Census photographs from the 1880s show entire towns built almost exclusively from sod, roof to floor. The picturesque wooden homestead cabin that fills every western backdrop was, in reality, a luxury most frontier families never once owned. Fact 13. Grasshoppers destroyed more farms than any outlaw ever did. In 1874 and 1875, swarms of Rocky Mountain locusts, sometimes stretching more than a mile wide and blocking out the sun as they passed, descended on the plains and ate every crop, every piece of clothing left outside on a line, and reportedly even the wooden handles of farm tools for the salt left behind by human sweat. Entire counties in Nebraska and Kansas lost their whole year's harvest in under 2 hours of swarming. Government relief committees had to be formed on an emergency basis just to keep thousands of settler families from starving through the following winter. No outlaw gang in recorded history ever caused that much simultaneous economic destruction in a single afternoon, yet you will not find a single Western film built around the year the grasshoppers won. Fact 14. Most homesteaders failed within 5 years. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to work and improve it for 5 straight years. Government surveys conducted afterward found that well over half of all homestead claims filed were ultimately abandoned before that 5-year mark, defeated by drought, locusts, brutal isolation, or land that simply could not support a working farm at that size in that particular climate. The pioneer success story, ending with a thriving family farm passed down through generations, was the exception, not the rule. Quiet failure and a wagon ride back east in shame was the far more common ending, and it left almost no trace in the historical record because nobody writes a county history book about the families who quietly gave up and left. The winners kept the land and the story, the losers just kept moving, and history mostly forgot to ask where they went. Fact 15. Tombstone had strict gun control, and that is why the OK Corral happened at all. Most cattle towns, including both Tombstone and Dodge City, required visitors to check their firearms with the sheriff's office at the edge of town before they were allowed to walk down the main street armed. The gunfight at the OK Corral was not a spontaneous quick-draw duel born from personal hatred alone. It started specifically because the Clanton and McClory group refused to comply with the town's gun ordinance, and Wyatt Earp's group was sent, as an act of law enforcement, to disarm them by force if necessary. The most famous shootout in American history was, at its actual legal core, a fight over enforcing a weapons ordinance, not a grudge match between rivals. Fact 16. Black cavalry regiments patrolled most of the frontier. Nearly 1 in 5 soldiers stationed on the western frontier in the decades after the Civil War were black cavalrymen serving in segregated regiments that native tribes nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers, out of respect for their toughness. They built roads, escorted mail routes across dangerous territory, and fought in more documented frontier engagements than almost any other unit in the entire United States Army. Yet they appear in only a tiny handful of classic Western films, and almost always as background extras with no lines. An entire branch of the actual frontier military was quietly written out of the genre that claims, in every trailer, to represent it faithfully. Fact 17. Many tribes served as scouts for the U.S. Army. The simple image of the frontier as a clean two-sided war between settlers and native tribes ignores the fact that the Army employed thousands of native scouts, drawn from the Crow, Pawnee, Apache, and other nations, who tracked, guided, and fought directly alongside federal troops, often against rival tribes they already had long-standing conflicts with of their own. The frontier was never a single unified resistance standing against a single unified enemy. It was a shifting, complicated web of alliances and old rivalries that simply does not fit into a 2-hour movie with one clearly good side and one clearly bad side. Fact 18. The railroad replaced the wagon train, decades earlier than people assume. The image of a covered wagon train slowly crossing the open plains defines the entire Western migration story in almost every film ever made about it. But the Transcontinental Railroad was completed all the way in 1869. After that date, the overwhelming majority of westward migrants traveled by train in a matter of days rather than months, and wagon trains quickly became a minority option, used mainly by those too poor to afford a proper ticket. The genre kept filming slow, dusty wagon trains for another full century after most real settlers had already stopped using them entirely. Fact 19. Vigilante. Committees, not sheriffs, ran justice. In many towns, elected sheriffs in many frontier towns had no real jail, no paid deputies, and no meaningful authority to enforce much of anything at all. In their place, self-appointed vigilance committees made up of local business owners handed out punishments, including public hangings, with no trial held and no appeal possible afterward. San Francisco's Committee of Vigilance in the 1850s executed men by rope in broad daylight with a crowd of thousands watching from the street, entirely outside any real court system or legal process. The lone, honest sheriff walking calmly into danger alone was, in most actual towns, a comforting fiction standing in for an armed mob carrying a rope and a personal grudge. Nobody wanted to put Committee of Angry Shopkeepers on a movie poster, so the badge stayed and the mob quietly disappeared from the script. Fact 20. Many homesteaders were paid stand-ins for railroad companies. Railroad and timber corporations exploited loopholes in the Homestead Act by paying men, sometimes recent immigrants who barely spoke a word of English, $5 to file a claim on valuable timberland, then immediately sign the deed straight over to the company the moment the claim was officially approved by the land office. Federal investigators later documented tens of thousands of these fraudulent filings across the Pacific Northwest alone, a scandal that took years to fully untangle in court. The rugged individual homesteader bravely taming untamed wilderness with nothing but grit was, in a significant and well-documented number of cases, simply a paid actor filling out paperwork for a corporation that never once set foot on the actual property. Fact 21. A third of working cowboys were black or Mexican. Historical wage ledgers from Texas cattle outfits in the 1870s and 1880s show that roughly 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 working cowboys on any given drive were black or Mexican vaqueros, many of them formerly enslaved men who found that ranch work was one of the very few paid jobs available to them after emancipation. The word cowboy itself likely evolved from a term originally used, often dismissively, specifically for black ranch hands doing that exact work. Hollywood's decades-long insistence on an almost entirely white cowboy cast erased a huge and essential share of the actual historical workforce from its own origin story. Fact 22. Whiskey was often laced with poison to cut costs. Beyond simply weak or heavily diluted liquor, some frontier bartenders reportedly added tiny amounts of strychnine on purpose, specifically because it produced a sharp burning sensation that drinkers had come to associate with strong whiskey worth paying for. Newspaper coroner reports across multiple frontier states list confirmed poisoning deaths, traced directly back to specific named saloons and specific bad barrels. The men dying in these towns were not always dying from bullets fired by rivals. Some of them were dying from exactly what they were drinking, on a completely ordinary Tuesday night at their regular bar. Fact 23. Isolation killed more settlers than outlaws. County coroner and newspaper records from across the plains, states in the 1870s and 1880s, show suicide rates among isolated homesteaders, especially women who had moved from crowded, social eastern towns into total, silent prairie isolation, far exceeding deaths from any documented criminal violence in those exact same counties over the same years. Historians studying surviving diaries from the period describe a condition contemporaries themselves called prairie madness, brought on by endless flat land stretching in every direction, constant howling wind, and long months without seeing another human face outside the immediate family. The frontier's real, quiet killer had nothing to do with outlaws, bandits, or gunfights at all. Cheap paperback dime novels, sold by the millions during the exact same years the Old West was still actually happening, taught their publishers very quickly that fictional exaggeration sold far better than boring, accurate reporting ever could. Writers who had never once traveled west of Chicago invented entire fabricated biographies for real, living people, including Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane, while both were still alive and able to read the lies being printed about themselves on newsstands. Some of these real subjects eventually leaned into the fiction on purpose for the money, since the fake, larger-than-life version of themselves paid far better on the lecture circuit than the true, ordinary one ever could. Fact 25. The Old West did not end in 1890. It ended when the car arrived and men left for a world war. Every textbook repeats the exact same closing date, 1890, based on a single administrative line in a census bulletin stating that the frontier no longer had a clear settlement boundary that could be drawn cleanly on a map. On the actual ground, nothing meaningfully changed that particular year. Cattle drives, stagecoach routes, sod houses, and range wars all continued on, largely unbothered for decades afterward. What actually ended the Old West's true way of life was the mass arrival of the affordable automobile in rural counties by the 1910s, which replaced horses for everyday transport almost overnight, combined with a full generation of young rural men being drafted and shipped overseas for World War I, starting in 1917, permanently emptying out the small ranching communities that had sustained that entire culture for 2 generations. The frontier was not quietly closed by a Census Bureau clerk typing a single sentence in 1890. It was closed by a war draft notice arriving in a rural mailbox nearly 30 years later. And that is the version nobody ever taught you in school. 25 facts. 25 pieces of the frontier that never made it past a studio script department because the truth was slower, dirtier, more complicated, and far less profitable than the version with the white hat and the black hat. The real Old West did not need Hollywood to make it interesting. It needed Hollywood to make it simple. And simple is exactly what it never actually was. If one of these 25 surprised you, the rest of what you learned about the frontier is probably worth a second look too.